On December 21st, 1989, Nicolae Ceaușescu stood on a balcony to address a crowd of 100,000 people. He expected the usual, absolute silence and forced applause. Instead, he heard the one thing a dictator cannot survive: a booing crowd. In that split second, 24 years of absolute power evaporated. This isn't just the story of a political collapse. It's a 4-day frantic race from a golden palace to a cold concrete wall. From the genius of the Carpathians to a man facing a firing squad on Christmas Day. This is the rise and the sudden, violent fall of the last Stalinist titan, Nicolae Ceaușescu. The path to the most famous confrontation in modern history began in a tiny 3-room peasant hut in Scornicești. Nicolae Ceaușescu was born in 1918, the third of 10 children. His father was a harsh man who reportedly treated the children so severely that Nicolae developed a lifelong stutter. At age 11, he did the only thing a desperate kid could do. He ran. He walked to Bucharest and found work as an apprentice to a shoemaker. It was a lucky break, or a curse. His master was a member of the underground Communist Party. While other kids were reading literature, Nicolae was fixing boots and distributing forbidden pamphlets. By 15, he was a marked agitator. Between 1933 and 1944, Nicolae was a ghost in the Romanian prison system. He was arrested for his activities over and over. This is where the real education happened. In the Doftana prison, he met the future elite of the country. Nicolae became a loyal shadow to the leaders. While others debated theory, Nicolae was a street-level survivor. He learned that in the party, loyalty to the man at the top was the only currency that mattered. When the Red Army rolled into Bucharest in 1944, the small, stuttering shoemaker was positioned perfectly. He wasn't a genius. He was a machine. He spent the next 20 years climbing the ranks, quietly removing anyone with an actual education. By the time the top seat opened in 1965, Nicolae had already secured the loyalty of the internal security and the military. The quiet apprentice took the throne, and the world had no idea what was coming. By the late 1970s, the leader had completely lost touch with reality. He began calling himself the genius of the Carpathians. His wife, Elena, was promoted to the number 2 position in the country. She was a woman who had failed most of her early exams, yet she demanded to be called a world-famous scientist. The state media spent nearly every broadcast praising the couple. Nicolae grew obsessed with his own safety. He refused to eat food unless it had been checked by a professional. He wore a different suit every single day, which was destroyed at night because he was terrified that foreign agents would contaminate his clothes. While he lived in a palace with 24-karat gold fixtures, he decided to pay back Romania's $10 billion foreign debt all at once. His method? Extreme austerity. He exported 80% of the country's food. Meat vanished from stores. People were forced to eat scraps. He rationed heat and electricity. In the dead of winter, Romanian families lived in a single room, huddled around a gas stove that produced only a tiny flame because the pressure was too low. The streets were pitch black. The shops were empty. But the genius was building. To cement his legacy, Nicolae decided to rebuild Bucharest. He called it systematization. In reality, it was a wrecking ball. He leveled the historic center of the city. Landmarks, hospitals, and thousands of homes were destroyed in a matter of weeks. In their place, he began the Palace of the Parliament. It was a building so massive it required 20,000 workers around the clock. He used 700,000 tons of bronze, 1 million cubic feet of marble, and thousands of tons of crystal. He was so paranoid about his security that he had a secret transit line built directly into the basement and an escape hatch for a helicopter on the roof. While his people stood in line for 4 hours to buy a single loaf of bread, Nicolae walked through his marble halls, complaining that the aesthetics weren't pure enough. He was building a monument to himself in a city that was struggling to survive. The only reason the regime lasted this long was the Securitate. This wasn't just a police force, it was a surveillance machine. They had over 11,000 officers and 500,000 informants. They didn't just monitor people, they dismantled lives. They used a technique called the informant's web. They would pressure teachers to report on their students or threaten doctors to bug their own offices. In Romania, the walls had ears. People would turn the radio up to full volume just to have a conversation in their own kitchen. You couldn't trust your neighbors or even your friends. The Securitate even used the orphans from Decree 770 as their most loyal enforcers. Having grown up in the brutal state system, these youths knew no other loyalty but the party. They were trained to be the shield of the leader. They were formidable. The end began on December 16th, 1989. It didn't start with a political manifesto. It started with a man named Laszlo Tokes, a priest in the city of Timișoara who dared to criticize the regime's destruction of rural villages. When the state tried to remove him, his congregation formed a human chain around his house. By the next day, the crowd had grown to thousands. They weren't just protecting a priest anymore. They were demanding basic necessities and freedom. Nicolae, sitting in Bucharest, gave a simple order: end the protest. The security forces opened fire. Protesters were targeted in the streets. Scores lost their lives. Nicolae thought he had restored order. He left for a state visit to Iran. It was his final act of arrogance. He thought the force used in Timișoara would act as a warning. Instead, it was the spark that set the country on fire. Nicolae returned from Iran on December 20th. He was furious. He decided to hold a massive rally to show his popularity. On the morning of December 21st, 100,000 workers were brought into the center of Bucharest. They were given posters of Nicolae and Elena and told to cheer, but the mood was different. Nicolae stepped onto the balcony. He began his usual speech. Suddenly, a loud noise went off. The crowd panicked, and then a small group in the back did the unthinkable. They booed. The sound grew. A rhythmic chant started. Nicolae's eyes bulge. He raises his hand, trying to hush a stadium of angry citizens. He offered them a tiny raise in their benefits. It was too late. The crowd broke. They destroyed the posters and began to march. The genius retreated inside. That night, Bucharest was in chaos. Security forces fired from the rooftops. Barricades were built using overturned vehicles. Nicolae stayed inside, demanding that his generals liquidate the problem. But the problem was 23 million people. The next morning, the defense minister was found dead. The official story was suicide, but the military believed he had been taken out for refusing to fire on the people. The military broke. They turned their assets away from the protesters and toward the regime. The crowd breached the palace doors. Nicolae and Elena ran for the roof. A white helicopter touched down, and they escaped just seconds before the mob reached them. They thought they were escaping to a secret loyalist base. They were wrong. The pilot, realizing the regime was finished, landed on a highway. The most powerful couple in Romania were now hitchhiking. They were picked up by a local man who drove them around in circles while waiting for the authorities. By nightfall, they were captured and taken to a small military base. The most powerful couple in Eastern Europe were now sitting on 2 metal cots, listening to the radio announce the fall of their world. December 25th, 1989. While the rest of the world celebrated, Nicolae and Elena Ceaușescu faced a summary court-martial. It was a 55-minute trial held in a cramped room. Nicolae refused to recognize the court. He looked like a bewildered old man. Elena was different. She was combative. She insulted the guards and the judges. They were found guilty of mass atrocities and the destruction of the national economy. The sentence was carried out immediately. As they were led out, Elena realized it was over. She begged the soldiers for mercy. They were taken into a freezing courtyard. The intensity among the soldiers was so high that they didn't even wait for the formal signal. The socialism in one family project was over in a flash of gunfire. Nicolae and Elena were buried in a public cemetery. At first, their names weren't even on the markers, as the new authorities feared public anger would lead to the desecration of the site. Today, the Palace of the Parliament still stands, the most expensive administrative building in history. It is a haunting monument to what happens when a leader loses touch with the people. Nicolae Ceaușescu's fall wasn't just a political shift, it was a reckoning. He spent 24 years building a world of silence, and in the end, it only took 4 days for the voices of the people to be heard. He thought he was the architect of a new world, but he was really just a man who forgot that even the tallest wall eventually falls.